Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of American Rambler. I'm your host, Colin Woodward. Thank you for listening to the podcast. On today's show, I have Dr. James Oakes. He is the author of a new book on the Civil War era. It is called The Crooked Path to Abolition, Abraham Lincoln and the Anti-Slavery Constitution. It just came out, 2021. But Jim is also the author of several other books, including The Radical and the Republican, which is about Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. And he's also the author of The Ruling Race, which has been in print for a while, came out in the early 80s, was a book that I read in graduate school, and was the first book I taught when I was at LSU. I was only a teaching assistant at the time, but my professor had assigned The Ruling Race, and so it was my job to walk the students through that, and that went pretty well, thankfully. And students were pretty engaged with that book. It is a well-written book and well-researched. And he has published through trade presses, I believe, his whole career. I think everything's been through a trade press. His most recent book is. So he has not had to deal with the university presses, which, you know, I'm dealing with now. And so far, so good with University of Arkansas Press. But my experiences with UVA Press were a little bit more mixed, and certainly if you publish through a trade press, you usually get in advance a little bit of money. So that's good, and Jim's career has gone very well. He is moving out to California right now. He's been in New York for a while, but he's originally from New York, but he's been across the country several times, and he's headed back to California as we speak. So I hope that trip goes well for him. He can enjoy the nice weather, and seems like the wildfires have been somewhat quiet right now, but no matter where you are, you got to deal with the COVID, but hopefully we are going to be making some progress with that soon. I have not been vaccinated. I know a few people who have been vaccinated. You know, kind of wherever you are, it's different. Seem to be making not great progress in Virginia, but been kicking things up a little bit more recently. And I don't know who's doing great. You read things. I heard West Virginia is doing okay, but I don't know what's going on. But hopefully you are doing okay and having a good 2021 so far. We didn't see any violence on Inauguration Day. That was a good thing. But the weather is taking a nasty turn here, and it's pretty gross. And so I don't have much energy to do really anything right now, let alone give a long introduction. So I'll just stop right here. You can listen to me talk to James Oakes about his new book and how he got into academia in grad school. He studied under Kenneth Stampp at Berkeley. I wanted to know a little bit about him, and the department at the time was really a murderer's row of historians, a lot of big names in the field. And I know Berkeley is a great school, but if you are studying the slavery period or Civil War studies or the early Republic and civil rights too, for that matter, with Leon Litwack, it was quite a department. And I know it's still good, but at that time, the late 70s was pretty great. So Jim was in some good company, and obviously still is, going back to California, and I wish him the best with that. All right, I hope you're doing okay. Here it is, my talk with Jim Oakes.
Yeah, you were talking about your aversion to cold weather. I'm assuming when you were in California, you got really used to the nice, mild climate.
I sort of couldn't believe that such a place existed. I had never been to California till I flew out there to go to graduate school, and it's like, wow, it's not surprising that so many people live here. It's a question of why doesn't everyone live here?
No, I've thought a lot about it. I'm kind of obsessed. I've never actually been there, but my advisor at LSU, Charlie Royster, he went to Berkeley.
Oh, okay. Yeah. We overlapped a little bit.
You did see him there. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can't say we were friends or anything. He was finishing up as I was beginning, but
yeah. So you were at Berkeley in the late 70s. I was looking at sort of, I was finding some info on you and your trajectory. You seem like you finished pretty early, right? With your PhD.
I don't
I
know.
mean,
I entered in the fall of 74 and I finished in the spring of 81. So
but in terms of like how old you were, I mean,
oh,
you weren't.
yes. Well, that was because I
Yeah.
graduated from college early. I mean, I was 20
Yeah.
when I went to graduate school. In fact, in my first semester, I didn't have a card that would allow me to join my friends at bars after class on Friday afternoon or something like that for the first quarter until December when I turned 21.
Now, had you entered college kind of young, or did you just do a bunch of classes over the summer or something?
I guess it wasn't anything fancy. I finished.
Okay.
I graduated from high school a year early because I went to a high school where we took all our Regents exams at the end of our junior year, so I didn't have much to do. And I didn't want to spend another year at a school I wasn't particularly happy with. So I went to public school for a half a year.
Okay.
And finished in January. So I started college a half a semester early. And then I took some summer school classes. I finished that in 3.5 years. So between high school and college, I was a year earlier than most.
I see.
But there was nothing special. I mean, I wasn't a genius who out through all my coursework.
Yeah, well, you've done pretty well for yourself, but yeah, I didn't know if you were like you'd skipped a grade or something.
No, it was just a series of unfortunate incidents.
But you didn't like you were at a private school?
I was at a Catholic school.
Okay. Are you Catholic?
No,
or were?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I'd say lapsed is the word, I suppose.
Yes. Me too. I didn't go to Catholic school, but I was very Catholic for most of high school.
Right.
Right. And I have not been to church in a while.
Right.
But you went to CUNY as an undergrad.
I went to Baruch College, which is the business school.
Okay.
And planned to study international banking.
Oh, wow.
And at the end of my freshman composition class, my English professor called me to her office and said, I don't really care what you major in, but if you stay in business, you will be bored to tears. That was her term, bored to tears.
Yeah.
And so I was used to, I had been to Catholic elementary and Catholic high school, and I wasn't used to people caring about me. And so I was very impressionable, and I took her advice and I began shopping around, and then I had another teacher in the introductory survey of U.S. history, the second half, who also took an interest in me and suggested that I apply for one of those PhD programs. And I did, and the rest is history.
So what was business school all that about? Was that, was someone in the family, or just wanted to make money?
I don't know. I don't know. I just sort of said, I have no idea where it came from.
Yeah.
I don't remember.
I didn't know, when I was an undergrad, I was not set on history. I mean, I liked it. Right. I felt like I was good at it, but I was going to be a psychology major.
Right.
Because I wanted to know what's going through people's heads.
Right.
And I guess I still am. As a historian, that's kind of what you are doing to a certain degree.
In some sense, yes, you have to get some.
Yeah.
It's not always easy. Like, it's very hard to get inside Lincoln's head, actually, when you think about it.
Yeah,
the same thing with Frederick Douglass, actually. When I wrote about the both of them, I actually found it, I had planned to do a dual biography, but I found it virtually impossible to get inside either of those two guys' heads. I knew them as public persons, and I knew them well. I came to know them, I think, pretty well as public persons, but I found it very difficult to go inside their heads. David Blight has done as good a job as I've ever seen in his recent biography.
With Douglass.
Getting inside his head, but I found it very difficult. Yeah,
well, you're in some pretty good company with what you've been writing, and I mean, obviously, you said that you weren't thinking about being a historian initially, but you've really, obviously, the 19th century is your period. Kind of, as someone raised in New York City, which is such a modern place, what was it about the 19th century that attracted you? Because your first book is about slaveholders. So, how did you get into that subject?
I had read The Peculiar Institution in the first history class that I took, the first half of the U.S. History Survey. And the first book we read in the second half of the U.S. History Survey in the class with the teacher who ultimately persuaded me to go into history was The Era of Reconstruction. So I got Kenneth Stampp on the brain, right? From the very beginning. And I naturally, when it came to applying to graduate programs, I applied to the one where he taught and got in. So that was, to some extent, that was it. Just an inspiration from reading his books. So,
okay. Had you read a lot of history growing up? No,
I hadn't. It wasn't until I remember reading The Peculiar Institution as, in fact, it may have been the first serious history book that I ever read, and I was stunned by it.
Yeah, it's funny. I did not ever have that assigned to me in graduate school. I think I read it for either general exams or when I was working on my dissertation, but
right.
Certainly it was a path-breaking book when it came out. And I mean, you got to work with Kenneth Stampp, so that must have been a little surreal. You read this book that it influences you so much.
Yeah, I mean, I was 17 when I read it, and I was very impressionable.
Okay.
So
yeah.
It wasn't sort of a graduate school reading experience. It was a very impressionable 17-year-old who may even have been 16. And I don't know, it was the first experience of reading something like that. So I had no context for it. I didn't know he was responding to U.E. Phillips. I didn't know what had happened since The Peculiar Institution had been published. But I will say that in the spring of 1974, when I was waiting to hear from graduate schools, Time on the Cross was published.
Right.
And I was fully aware of the enormous significance of that. When I went to graduate school, I was almost as interested in the Cold War. I was just as interested in the Cold War. I had read Garel Perovitz's book, Atomic Diplomacy, and was strongly influenced by that as well, and thought about doing Cold War. But as it happened in the spring of 74 and over the course of the summer, there was a huge national brouhaha over this book. And it turned out that many of the people at Berkeley were in the thick of that. When I got there, everyone was passing around huge manuscripts written by Richard Such over in the Econ department that subsequently got published as some of his major critiques. And one of the first critical reviews of the book was published in Psychology Today by Winthrop Jordan. And Winthrop Jordan was the first professor I had in my survey for my class when I got to Berkeley. So it was all over the place. Everybody was talking about Stampp was in the middle of that controversy. And so it just became very easy to get swept up in that. And I ended up in a department, sort of serendipitously, that was full of people who were writing about that stuff. Larry Levine was working on Black culture and Black consciousness. Leon was working on Been in the Storm So Long. Al Raboteau was working on slave religion. Charlie Sellers was working on the market revolution. And it was just turned out to be a place where, if you were at all interested in any aspect of slavery and the like, it was just so easy to fall into that. Whereas there was one Cold War historian there, and I would have had to work with that one person, whereas I sort of enjoyed the fact that I was hopping around and, influenced and talking and going to lunch with Charlie Sellers And I could just as easily have ended up being a Leon Litwack student, because Stamp's was the first research seminar I took, and Litwack's was the last. And at the end of Leon's seminar, it wasn't clear to me whether I would ask him or ask Stampp if I could work with them. And I was a little embarrassed when I finally decided to work with Stampp, to tell Leon, because we had gotten along really well and we had a great seminar. And he smiled and said, "No, look, I'm a Stampp student. You don't have to explain it. You don't have to explain why you want to work with Stampp."
Yeah.
And he got me my first book contract. He called up he read my dissertation, and he was in some ways critical of it, but he called up his editor at Knopf and got me a contract before I had the dissertation, before I had signed off on the dissertation. So he was very good to me, and his seminar was it had 4 people in it, and it had Jim Grossman was in the seminar, Jim Gregory was in the seminar, and Robbie Colin was in the seminar. So the 4 of us, and it was amazing. It was very difficult. It was like 2 or 3 books a week, and
yeah,
4 of us were all very aggressive and talkative.
That sounds familiar. This is your first year?
This was my last year. That was my last.
I'm sorry, your last year.
Experience in graduate school, and it was so great. And as I said, when I finished that, and I got the paper I wrote was the only article I've ever submitted and published in a journal, was the seminar paper I wrote for Leon. So
what journal was that?
It was a Civil War history. It was
Okay.
on the Freedmen's Bureau.
All right.
Freedmen's Bureau courts.
Well, I think I don't know really how it was structured there in terms of coursework, but I think that's a good idea to have a seminar toward the end, because in my program, it was front loaded with classes. So by the time you were doing your dissertation, you weren't in class anymore. And I started to feel like I was getting a little untethered. And
I think that's a common experience. I mean, as soon as I was finished my orals and had my, dissertation prospectus accepted, I took off. I went and lived in Durham and Chapel Hill for 2 years doing my research. So I was basically completely disconnected from the program.
Yeah.
And when I got back, several people were gone who had been there. Charlie was gone.
Right.
Bill Gienapp was gone. Steve Maislish was gone. All these people who I had worked with as colleagues and as Stampp students. And meanwhile, there were a bunch of new people around, who became friends. And it was like 2 different experiences of graduate school, the first years and the last years. So,
yeah.
So it's fairly common to feel disconnected especially if you're going off to do research, which is how I did it.
Yeah, well, the Ruling Race was really the first book I ever taught when I was a grad student. I had a survey class, and I was teaching your book, and I certainly was impressed, by how well written it was, but also the research. And obviously, you said you were there for 2 years doing research.
Yeah, I lived at the Southern Historical Collection for a very long time, and then we moved to Durham, and I lived at the Duke. Those are the 2 biggest repositories for the sources that I was looking at, which is basically the letters and diaries of slaveholders, the family papers.
Yeah.
So, in fact, many, many years later, I thought that's what you do. You go and that's what you do. You go and you live where the sources are. And then I made some side trips to Charlottesville and Washington and LSU and the like. But those were the major places. Many years later, when was it? When I was at a reception somewhere, and a woman came up to me who had worked at the Southern Historical Collection and said that everybody remembered me because I was there for so long. That that they were all impressed that most people who do research at the Southern Historical Collection come in for a a few days, a few weeks, maybe, but I was there for months and months. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
I didn't think much of it, but
that's nice. And were you teaching at all, or you just straight up research?
I had a fellowship.
Okay.
To go off and travel, a 2-year traveling fellowship from Berkeley.
Oh, wow.
So
wow.
It wasn't much money, but it was enough to keep me.
Yeah, well,
my future wife was with me, and she was working. So
okay, well, there you go. Yeah. Well, and I hearing about your story, getting a contract from Knopf before the dissertation's even done. I mean, does that happen anymore?
I don't think it happened then, but and I'm not, and I wouldn't, and can I say I don't think I would recommend it.
Why is that?
Well, because in certain ways that book was written naively.
Yeah.
That is, there was a guy in the law school, a distinguished legal historian. I'm embarrassed to say I can't remember his name, but he wrote books about slave law. Persons and Masks of the Law was one of them. He wrote a book about Antelope. I took a seminar with him, and I was supposed to study legal history, but he just said, just go to the archives or to the sources and just write what you find in the sources. And that's sort of the way I was taught, that you don't worry about the historiography, just read the sources and write what you find.
Okay.
So I wrote a paper for him on the evolution of the slave laws of Maryland in the 17th century, 17th, 18th centuries, but without any reference to what anyone else had written. And to some extent, that's the way I wrote the dissertation, which is virtually unchanged from the book. And I think it would have been helpful if I had, let's say, been more familiar with certain aspects of the historiography and knew how to frame the argument. It's not that the substance of the book would have changed substantially, but there were certain things about it that were intellectually naive.
Yeah. Well, it's a hard balance sometimes, and when you're working on your first book, and how much historiography do you want to bring in, because it's not my strong suit. And the problem with historiography is that once you're done talking about it in your book, it's outdated before you even start writing about it.
Yeah, because I don't want to give the impression that I think people should write historiographically. I don't.
Sure.
I don't. It's that, for example, the book is understood to be one of the first arguments for against Genovese for slavery as a capitalist system. And the fact is, there is no political economy or economic history in the book. It was strictly cultural social history. And had I been more familiar with or on top of the political economic literature, I was to the extent that like the introduction mentions Genovese, right? But it wasn't in the dissertation. The only thing that's different about the dissertation and the book is that a friend of mine who read the dissertation said you need to explain yourself about Genovese. So I added a few paragraphs because what I knew mostly was roll, Jordan, roll, and I disagreed with the paternalist thesis.
Right.
But I didn't necessarily disagree with the political economy of slavery, right? And then I went off to Purdue and I spent a year with Hal Woodman, and I learned about the political economy of slavery pretty quickly, and he was terrific. And by the time I went to Princeton, after even a semester, actually that's not true. I had been reading about the political economy of slavery. It just wasn't what the book was about. The first book was about. But when I went off to Princeton to give a job talk, I think it was December of the first year when I was at Purdue, the job talk, I gave a talk about the political economy of slavery. My book wasn't even out yet. It was in galleys. And the theme of the talk was the slave economy grew, whereas the Northern economy developed. And this was a fundamental difference between the two. That one simply expanded the way it was, whereas the Northern economy was developing and becoming industrial and urban and things like that. So I was aware of that even before the book came out, but the book itself doesn't say anything about that.
Okay.
So there's no economic or political economy, history or political economy in the book. And had I waited a year, that would have been in there.
Yeah.
And it would have had a different feel.
Okay.
And a slightly different reception. A somewhat different reception, I think.
Yeah, I understand that. I mean, I think, for my first book, getting that beat down from the first peer reviewer was not fun, but I think it did better the book in the long term.
Right.
And forced me to bring in more historiography, because it is kind of tricky. I understand what you're saying. Like, Genovese is kind of the elephant in the room, and he wasn't there in your book. But I think, what you did was pretty important in terms of putting the emphasis on who the real slaveholders were, in terms of small slaveholders owning 1 to 5. They're living in these very sort of shaky structures on the frontier. They're not, it's not the Gone with the Wind type of plantation. So I think maybe, I put this in the outline. I think some reviewers who were reviewing it initially, they maybe were kind of a bit harsh on the, not maybe confronting Genovese head on, but maybe also missing this other story that you're telling about the small slaveholders. Right.
That also, there's another aspect of the naivete of the book that has to do with the political history, right? So I wrote that as a social, as I said, social, slightly, not really cultural history, but mostly social history of a certain type. But the point about the small slaveholders that I make in the book, but didn't follow through with in a real dig into the political history, was that they represented a substantial proportion of the electorate. And in the lower South, if you count people who went in and out of slaveholding and rented slaveholding, they're a majority. So it's not hard to understand why the Southern state legislatures were so overwhelmingly pro-slavery, even though the planters are a tiny minority. There was a social basis to slaveholding that helped explain, to some extent, why in legislatures that had been reformed in much the same way Northern legislatures had been, that is, they were based on universal white manhood suffrage, the slaveholders nevertheless dominated. And I think I could have done more in the book to explain that. And used my findings to explain that.
Yeah, I understand that. But to your credit, I mean, the book had a big influence on me, because you are kind of talking, you're framing the slaveholders as part of the American dream, really, in a sense. It's dark, but it's kind of dark anyway, right? I mean,
No, I would, if I had done Northern farmers, it wouldn't have been as dark, I suppose. But if I were to do a comparable history of Northern farmers, I would have to talk about domestic patriarchy and the dispossession of the Native Americans that was required for Northern agriculture to do what it did, and things like that. It's there is darkness in the entire history.
Sure.
And it's more than just, and of course, I worked with Leon, so I was fully aware of the history of racial discrimination in the northern states too.
Yeah. No, just to go back to Stampp a little bit, like, what was he like as an advisor?
Well, I had him in two different venues. Right? He was in my first year. The first research seminar I took was his research seminar on the Civil War era. And again, there were only 4 or 5 of us in the seminar, and so it was, and he was hands-on and not. I mean, he never imposed his views on anyone, but he basically ran the first. It was a 2-quarter seminar, so it went for 20 weeks, right?
Okay.
Plus a break in between, and the entire first quarter, he had us systematically review the major bodies of source material that anyone working in the Civil War era would have to familiarize themselves with. I believe there were 12 different, he gave us a list of 12 different sources. There were about 4 of us, so each of us got assigned 3 sources, and every week we'd have to come in and report on what we found in those sources. And I remember I had newspapers and I had the official records of the War of the Rebellion. And so by the time you were halfway through the seminar, you pretty much knew what your source materials were. So, and that was a kind of research seminar that I've never been able to duplicate myself, because every other program I've ever taught in, research seminars tend to be generic, right? That all of the Americanists take a research seminar and then find an individual advisor to help them through, their particular study. But the idea of teaching a research seminar on the Civil War era, I've never had that experience, or on slavery or Southern history. No, I've never been able to do anything like that. So I was fortunate to have that experience with him, and he was good, and he was rigorous, and he demanding, and as I said, hands-on. But as an advisor, as a dissertation advisor, he was exactly the opposite. He was laissez-faire, hands off. He didn't want to see drafts. You go off, you do your dissertation prospectus, he approves it, and come back with a finished dissertation.
Yeah, that sounds like Charlie Royster. He was very hands off. He would go to the Huntington Library for 18 months, and I'd be on my own in Baton Rouge. Right. And was he like a guy who's in the office in the library all the time, or did he have a domestic life?
Who, Stampp?
A Stampp, yeah.
Oh, he had. Yes, he was married to a wonderful woman.
Okay.
Isabel. Okay. It was his second marriage, and he was fairly shy and aloof, and he came off as stiff, and people thought he came off as arrogant, and I don't think he was. He wasn't a hail fellow, well met type person. Leon was much friendlier and in that sense, but so you didn't, and after and I think it was to some extent deliberate that he dealt with his PhD students from a distance on purpose, to maintain a distance, so that there's a common experience that we've had, that other Stampp students have talked about how once you're finished your dissertation, you're allowed to call him Ken and things like that. But
yeah, no, it's a weird moment when you finally call your advisor by the first name.
Right. And I'm not that way. There is a certain point along the way in graduate school where I feel like my graduate students are as much intellectual colleagues as they are students, and I start signing my emails Jim and stuff like that. So I'm not that way. Stampp was very. He was huge, and he was a very busy person, and he was the president of the OAH during my tenure as a graduate student. So he was out there, in the world, and so he had a very fulfilling private life and a travel life with his wonderful wife, and she softened the experience of having dinner at his house. Like, he would have us at Berkeley, the students came from everywhere, and it was the 1970s, and we didn't have a lot of money, so we tended to hang around during Christmas. So he always had a large number of his graduate students to dinner on Christmas Eve, and she hosted and she cooked. She was a phenomenal cook, and she made it a lot easier, those social occasions, because she was so gracious and friendly, and so.
Well, that's nice.
And it's not that he wasn't. He was an extremely gracious person too, but he was more aloof.
Okay. Now, I know you said that he didn't really impose his views on anyone, but was he at all active politically? I mean, because when a Peculiar Institution comes out, I mean, he's sort of coming across as this liberal voice in the historiography. Was he?
He was. He grew up in he was a German democratic socialist family from Wisconsin.
Okay.
I don't think his views ever changed. He didn't get crabby and reactionary when he got older. I had a similar experience when I was at Princeton. Karl Schorsky was that way. He too didn't get crabby and reactionary and stayed a kind of German democratic socialist. You know?
Okay.
And I saw them as similar in that sense. And even when I would see Stampp, when I'd go out to California and have lunch with him or visit him with him, his politics were just standard democratic socialist politics.
Okay.
So
because he was kind of the lone voice saying the abolitionists weren't a bunch of fanatics, you know. I mean, it took a long time for that shift to happen, and Stampp was kind of behind that. But
that's right.
Yeah. Did you ever meet Genovese?
Once. I have to say that by the time I was writing my dissertation, his reputation as sort of a bomb thrower was well established.
Right.
And I remember having conversations with Carl Degler about do you know what he did at Stony Brook? Do you know the story of Stony Brook? He was invited to be chair of the department at Stony Brook, right? And he had an interview and it went well, and he went and met with the dean of the college and explained to the dean that when he got there and took over the department, some heads were going to have to roll. This is what Carl Degler told me. And the dean called up the department and said, "Do you have any idea what this guy is planning for you guys?"
Oh, wow.
And they withdrew the invitation. So, he had a reputation for being basically a Stalinist. You know?
Right.
And so I think he was absolutely brilliant. The power that comes through his prose is still stunning to me. I think The Political Economy of Slavery is the turning point for me in the historiography of the slave economy in certain ways. But I kept my distance.
Sure.
I mean, when he started that organization, the historians, I forget. He was frustrated by the political correctness of the mainstream historical associations, and he set up his own organization. And he would call me up and try to recruit me and things like that. And even among the most modest, even the most benign circumstances, I'm not a joiner. Within the profession, I don't go to meetings. I don't give talks at meetings. I do them when a friend gets on the program committee and asks me to give a paper or a chair, or if one of my students has organized a session and asked me to chair a session, I'll do it. But it's just extremely rare. I don't show up, but I'm not a known quantity at the Southern Historical Association or the OAH meetings and things like that. I just was never interested in that part of being a historian.
Yeah, I understand that. I make myself do that type of thing. I mean, I don't like to think of myself as an especially outgoing person that needs to talk in front of groups and things like that. So I'll maybe do 1, maybe 2 a year, and the smaller the better. Sometimes I haven't been to a big conference in a long time, so I totally understand that. But
right. I give talks. I'm always giving talks, but not in those circumstances, not at conferences. Not
sure.
I get invited to give talks all the time. So
okay, well, when you said what was it, reactionary and cranky, Genovese immediately popped into my head.
Well, here's a story I'll tell you. This is amazing to me. I can't believe this happened. Ken Stampp told me while I was in graduate school, he actually predicted before Genovese turned that at some point Genovese was going to go back to the Catholic Church. That he called it soapbox syndrome, right? After 1989, when there was no more communist regime to which he could, to which Genovese could feel attached, he went back to another authoritarian institution to which he could feel attached, and that was the Catholic Church. And Stampp actually predicted that he would do that to me.
That's interesting.
And he did. And
yeah, well, no, it's kind of like there's one of those people. They're so left, they just go right.
Well, I was all right from the start. I would tell people that I thought I sequester the political economy of slavery and to some extent the fruits of merchant capitalism. When he wrote about political economy, I thought he was absolutely brilliant and not much to disagree with. Factual errors, sure, facts and things like that. But I thought that The World the Slaveholders Made and Roll Jordan Roll and were fundamentally deeply reactionary books. And actually, I was kind of taught that Charlie Sellers told me that he thought that Genovese was fundamentally reactionary long before anybody else did. So I would tell people that I didn't see there was in some sense no real shift, that a person who could write about George Fitzhugh the way he wrote in the World the Slaveholders Made was not fundamentally different to me from the person who wrote much later on about his admiration for Southern conservatives.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And I remember when I read Roll Jordan Roll, I was like, I know this is supposed to be some sort of Marxist tome, but no, the admiration for the slaveholders starts to take hold after a while, and it's pretty disturbing. But I talked to Stephanie McCurry, who's at Columbia, and I don't know if you know her, but she studied with Genovese.
Yes.
And I think she had sort of a post-traumatic stress situation with him. I mean, he was just a real pain in the ass. And he and Christopher Lasch hated each other, apparently, at Rochester.
And, not unlike he and Gutman.
Just everywhere he went.
Everywhere he went. Fights I heard about fist fights in the halls at Rutgers when he was there.
Oh, my God.
And stuff like that. So that's why all of that stuff was known when I was a graduate student, and it's the reason I kept my distance. It's a shame, really, because I actually think the burial of Genovese has gone too far. That this is a guy you had to deal with when I was in graduate school and when I was a young historian, and because I disagreed with him, his own students just went after me because I had the effrontery to disagree with him on these issues. And he was huge. He was enormously significant.
Yeah.
And the decline of his reputation and significance has been astonishing to me, even though we're back, to a situation where we are once again interested in the all-important question of the relationship between capitalism and slavery. He ought to be front and center in that discussion. And he's not, and he should be, because he was brilliant.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know, maybe, I don't know what he was, I think he was from New York originally, wasn't he?
Brooklyn.
Yeah. So I don't know if he kind of thought of himself as this sort of Norman Mailer type of guy who's, brawling and pissing off the intellectuals.
Dock worker. Yeah. Right out of what's that Marlon Brando movie?
Yes, on the waterfront, right?
That's how I think of him. That's where he grew up.
So in some ways, it's kind of sad that maybe we need a guy like that around. Maybe you don't want to be in the same room with him, but intellectually, maybe we do need those guys.
His flaws were as prodigious as his intellect, and it's frustrating. Kind of comment.
Well, and it was funny because earlier on in my career, I would hear about where Genovese was. It seems like he was kind of bouncing around from school to school, and it took me a long time to understand why.
Right.
Because he's just
he's a very difficult person.
Yeah. He's just a
in some ways, on the other hand, he was an extremely gracious person. It was kind of a frustrating combination, when Betsy was writing within the plantation household, she asked me to read the manuscript. She was that was at the same time that he was trying to recruit me to his Historians Association and things like that. And, And I went down he was at the National Humanities Center in the Research Triangle one year, and he invited me down for a conference he had, and he took me aside and he talked to me, and he was very gracious and stuff like that. He could be that way. I knew personal experience that he could be that way, but I also knew that he had this dark side that he abused his graduate students, that they both abused their graduate students, and that I knew that Stephanie had a difficult time, but I also know that other of his graduate students felt used and abused by him and like that. So
that's really unfortunate. I mean, I had my days with my advisor, but it was certainly nothing like what I've heard Genovese would do. And obviously the two of them, Elizabeth and him together, I mean, were formidable intellectually, but it sounds like also in terms of personality, it was tough to navigate that.
I don't know why we're talking about him so much.
Well, he's like you said, he's made a huge stamp on the historiography, and everyone kind of has to reckon with him. Maybe they don't as much as you did and some others have, but maybe he'll not necessarily be rehabilitated, but people will talk about him more. I mean, since he has been gone a little while now, maybe that'll happen.
Right.
So I mean, you've had a pretty great career. I mean, so you're at Princeton, but did you say you didn't like it, or your wife didn't?
My wife didn't like it. It was a very difficult place for women. When we got there, there was a whole generation of older faculty wives who were sort of eccentric and often alcoholic. It didn't seem like particularly useful. If you were on the faculty, it was one thing. I don't know what the experience of people like Chris Stansel and Natalie Davis was there, so I don't think it was the problem. I think the problem was the older wives.
Okay.
But it was, for me, I said I'm not particularly. I don't particularly professionalize. I'm not interested in the profession, the history as a profession. But the thing that I liked about Princeton was the thing that it was that this hothouse womb-like situation, right? Where it's just purely you were admired or not admired purely for your intellect. And I sort of thrived in that situation, but if you weren't inside of that, it could be a very alienating place.
Yeah.
And so, and Princeton is, it's a small university town. That's what there is. It's a one industry town in that sense. And so, whereas, if you're in Chicago, there's everything's there. It's much easier. And Evanston is a very nice place to live. In certain ways, it's a very nice town.
So how long were you at Princeton?
About 4 or 5 years.
Okay. And were you were tenure track, or did you get tenure?
Yes. I after the department voted I got the job offer at Northwestern, and the department responded by offering me tenure, but I left.
Okay. And you were how long at Northwestern?
12 years.
Okay. So that's a good chunk of time, but Chicago, the weather just wore you down.
I wasn't particularly comfortable in that department So.
Oh yeah. Okay.
It wasn't what I was used to. I was alas assimilated to the profession at Princeton, where you were evaluated by what they would call the quality of your mind. And I just took that with me to Northwestern, and they didn't have that standard. If you said something in a meeting like, this candidate has a good mind, people would like flinch. Like, what does that mean? What does that mean? It wasn't a standard. And smart was not a criterion that people were interested in. They thought it was weird. So I just was not comfortable. I was a sore thumb in that department. And so, so I never felt comfortable there. So the combination of not liking living in that weather and that place, and even though, and the combination not being particularly comfortable in my own department. So I was prepared to go somewhere. And then, New York it's not that I desperately wanted to live in New York, because as I said, I'm not a New York nationalist, but New York it's like I grew up here, so it was like a comfortable old shoe.
Yeah.
Easy for me to fit in here, because
you've had the ability to live in some very different parts of the country, and obviously doing your research in the South, so you got to see the South, but you've kind of been coast to coast, and back again. Let me kind of spend maybe the last 10 or however many minutes talking about your new book, because you've been pretty prolific in the last few years, and your books have done very well. You won the Lincoln Prize twice, but obviously you've made the shift into writing a lot about emancipation, Douglass. What is your new book on? What's your new research?
This was a accidental book. It was. I'm supposed to be writing a general history of the Civil War, and I expect to turn to drafting that as soon as we get out and settled in California. But I didn't expect to write a history of Abraham Lincoln, or a book about Abraham Lincoln again. But I had written this essay on the origins of the 13th Amendment, which is now the last chapter of the book. And my editor at Norton read it and said, look, it's been a while since you published your last book, and so can you turn this into a book quickly, a short book? And as it happened, I was at the time teaching a couple of seminars on slavery and the Constitution, specifically on anti-slavery constitutionalism, the belief of the vast majority of Northerners that the Constitution was an anti-slavery document. I taught it at the Georgetown Law School once. I taught it at a seminar at the New York Historical Society once, a second time. So I was sitting on this material, and I knew that this was the tradition that Lincoln came out of. So I was able to put the stuff from the seminar together with a couple of essays I had written on Lincoln and the Civil War and the emancipation. And some of it is familiar, some of it grows out of the earlier stuff. In some ways, it's a logical extension of the earlier stuff. Basically, it comes down to the realization that when William Lloyd Garrison burned the Constitution as a pro-slavery document, he made himself something of an outcast by doing so within the anti-slavery community in the North. He sidelined himself because the overwhelming majority of abolitionists did not believe that. They believed that the Constitution was an anti-slavery document, and some believed it was an absolutely abolitionist document. And I needed to in the historiography, Garrison's view of the Constitution is taken almost as orthodox. And I realized that that even from the start, even as the Constitution was being debated during the ratification process, anti-slavery people did not think of the Constitution as a pro-slavery document. Some of them disliked certain pieces of the Constitution, wished this hadn't been there or that had. But some of them, just as many people, anti-slavery people praised the Constitution. And there's no such thing as pro-slavery constitutionalism or anti-slavery constitutionalism until the Missouri crisis. And then you see two very, very different conceptions of the Constitution being articulated in those debates, and the Southerners are saying that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document, and the Northern majority overwhelmingly is saying no, the Constitution does not contain a constitutional, does not acknowledge a right of property in slaves. That does not, so you ask a series of questions now. Does the Constitution empower Congress to ban slavery from the Western territories? And the answer is yes. Did the Constitution, as originally written, empower Congress to take control of the Atlantic slave trade away from the states and ban it? And the answer is yes. Right? And did the Constitution empower Congress to abolish slavery in Washington, D.C.? And the answer is yes. And and you keep going. Does the Constitution not say that no person shall be deprived of liberty without due process of law? It does. And what exactly does the Fugitive Slave Law give to the slaveholders? So the Fugitive Slave Clause, does it give them a very narrowly conceived right of recaption, which is what anti-slavery people said, or does it give them a broad right of property, which is what the pro-slavery people said? So I had to recover a long history of anti-slavery constitutionalism so that I could explain Lincoln and why, once he gets into the Civil War, he immediately begins to act on, and the Republicans in Congress begin to act on, the premise that had long been established in anti-slavery circles, that the Constitution was fundamentally an anti-slavery document, that the founders intended to put slavery on a course of ultimate extinction, that they made a couple of concessions to the slaveholders in order to create a union, but that they but that the Constitution overwhelmingly was an anti-slavery document. And there's actually a kind of soundbite that rings through the political rhetoric of the 1850s in the North that says that freedom is the rule, slavery is the exception. In the Constitution, the rule is freedom, the exception is slavery. And you hear this phrase over and over again. And so that's what this book does. It sort of recovers that anti-slavery constitutional tradition and places Lincoln dead center in it.
Okay. Well, and people still debate, how radical Lincoln was. People also talk about, was he racist? Was he not? Do you see him as kind of more in the radical school of Republicans? I mean, I know there's an evolution there, but on the whole, where do you kind of put him ideologically?
Well, it depends on where. He's not as radical as the radicals. Radicals.
He's not an abolitionist.
Here's how I think of it. When we use terms like conservative or moderate, we're usually judging him against the standard of the radicals and the abolitionists. But if you think of the American political spectrum in the 1850s, when the issue of the day was slavery, right? You can crudely divide that spectrum from left to right on the French model. Let's say the right wing is occupied, let's say a third of the right of the wing of the spectrum is occupied by pro-slavery Democrats. That's the right wing of American politics in the 1850s. Right? At the center, there are two broad groups. Let's call them Upper South Whigs and Northern Democrats, who are not as extreme in their pro-slavery views as the Southern Deep South Democrats, but not anti-slavery in the way that the Republicans are. And then say the left third of the spectrum is occupied by the Republicans, and within that spectrum, there are the more conservative Republicans and the more radical Republicans, and Lincoln is generally put sort of squarely at the center of his party, right? But where does that place him on the larger spectrum of American politics, right? It places him at the center of the left, right? And he's much closer to the left. And I think while there are differences between radicals and mainstream Republicans, many of those differences are rhetorical rather than substantive. Like, for example, we think of immediatism as the radical position, right? But the immediatists, even Garrison, believed the Constitution was a pro-slavery document, which meant that politically there was nothing they could advocate that the federal government could or should do right? So immediatism is a rhetorical stance. It is not a program. It is not a practical politics, right? And there is no real practical political position, set of policies, anti-slavery policies, that substantially differentiate Lincoln from the radicals. Right? That there are a couple of positions you could say. There were radicals who did believe that the Constitution allowed the Congress to regulate and shut down the domestic slave trade, but it wasn't a big issue, right? But there wasn't much in the way of, Lincoln believed the Congress could and should abolish slavery in Washington, D.C. He believed the Congress could and should abolish slavery, ban slavery from all the Western territories. He believed the Congress that there was no constitutional right of property in the Constitution, and therefore and he believed that the fugitive slaves should be given due process rights, right? And that the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 should be revised to give them due process rights. Those are all the same positions that radicals take.
Yeah.
And so substantively, his politics is much closer to the radical position, and it's getting more and more radical as Northern anti-slavery politics gets more radical. So think about it. David Potter's great old book, The Impending Crisis. The theme of the book is the collapse of the middle ground, if you recall, and he starts the book with the late 1840s, when there are four positions on the table. There's two extreme positions, which is the absolute free soil position and the Calhounite position on the right, which is that the slavery follows the Constitution, right? And in the middle are these two middle ground positions, which are popular sovereignty and the extension of the Missouri Compromise. And they fall out. And the history of the 1850s is the disappearance of the middle ground for him. And if that's the case, that means that by the late 1850s, Lincoln has taken what he himself had defined as an extreme position, one of the two extremes of the late 1840s. That's where Lincoln is by the late 1850s. In 1854, he's calling for the restoration of the Missouri Compromise. By 1860, he's saying absolutely no slavery anywhere in the territories. So he's taking a more extreme position. He takes a more extreme, after Dred Scott, he takes a more extreme position on black citizenship. And by his inaugural address, he's calling for a revised fugitive slave law that recognizes that the rights of due process for accused fugitives. And there are a couple of other positions. He's moving in a more radical direction over the course of the 1850s, and that radicalization accelerates during the Civil War. And it's not just Lincoln. No. The most salient example for me is the speech he gives in 1859 in Cincinnati, in which he sort of metaphorically looks across the Ohio River and says to Southerners, you guys claim that you will leave the Union if a Republican wins next year's presidential election on the grounds that we will not return your fugitive slaves to you. What do you think will happen when you do that? You won't get any of your slaves back if you secede from the Union. You think that secession is going to solve your problem? You're not going to get any. We will be relieved of any constitutional obligation to return your fugitive slaves if you secede. Now, that's a position that was first articulated very clearly in a book by William Jay, the abolitionist, in 1839. And Lincoln is saying it in public 2 decades later. And he repeats it in his inaugural address. He said, your slaves, now only partially returned, will not be returned at all. Will not be returned at all if you secede from the Union. He says this in his inaugural address. And that's what happens. Within a few weeks after Fort Sumter, the issue arrives from General Benjamin Butler from Fortress Monroe. Am I allowed? I haven't returned these slaves. Am I allowed to do this? And when the cabinet meeting is over, the Secretary of War sends Butler a telegram saying your decision not to return fugitive slaves is approved by the cabinet, by the Lincoln administration, by Lincoln. Right? So you see these positions that get taken and articulated in the decades and years before the Civil War being acted on during the Civil War and becoming more and more and more aggressive over the course of the war. So that's basically what the book is about. It's like it doesn't suddenly the war comes and everything changes. The war does change things, but it changes things mostly because the balance of power has changed, and it changes in ways that could be predicted on the basis of what had happened in the decades and years before. It is increasingly clear, for example, that historians recognize that there was, over the course of the 1850s, a fugitive slave crisis, that the fugitive slave law of 1850 immediately provoked a crisis, right, across the North. That Harriet Beecher Stowe's book was in some ways inspired by this hostility to the fugitive slave law. And Northerners go into the war after a decade of famous cases of slaves who are being dragged back to the South, or massive Northern crowds refusing to return slaves to the South. Northern legislatures passing a series of anti-kidnapping laws designed to thwart and frustrate the fugitive slave law. What makes us think that when the people who passed those laws and resisted enforcement of the fugitive slave laws finally take power in the spring of 1861, they aren't going to act on those principles? They are suddenly going to start returning slaves that they've been saying they didn't want to return. So it doesn't make much sense historically to me to think that suddenly, or Lincoln had to be forced to acknowledge that the slaves were running to Union lines, and he was forced to come to the conclusion that he didn't want to return them. He's articulating this position right from the start. He says it in his inaugural address. He says it.
Well, it's been interesting to see this historiographical shift to focus a lot more attention on the war itself, because in grad school, I was reading a lot of books that just sort of seemed to end in 1860, and you're left to kind of fill in the gaps or assume, the war takes care of everything. But it's been good to see this shift in how people are looking at the war and how things change year to year, like you said, starting with Fort Monroe and then going into Congress banning slavery in the territories and everything. So that's been a nice gap to see filled.
Right.
When you first you've been writing about Lincoln for a while. Were you intimidated at all by just how big the historiography is and trying to say something new about him?
No, I didn't think of it in those terms, because the first time I really dealt with him, when I was working on the Lincoln Frederick Douglass book, I mostly wanted to get inside his head, I suppose, but also I wanted to know I wanted to get their ideologies and what was different about them, and discovered that the theme of the book is their convergence, right? That there's a kind of double convergence, that Lincoln the politician becomes Lincoln the anti-slavery politician, and Frederick Douglass the anti-slavery agitator becomes the abolitionist becomes Frederick Douglass the Republican anti-slavery agitator, right? So they converge, and by 1860, Douglass has accepted that he's rejected the Garrisonian position, the anti-politics position, the non-voting stance, and he's accepted the need for politics and anti-slavery political activism. And then there's another kind of convergence that happens during the Civil War, when Douglass is initially frustrated by what he perceives to be Lincoln's slow pace, and as Lincoln's policies become more radical, Douglass's views of Lincoln become more benign, right? So by the end of the war, there's another kind of convergence that has taken place. And so I was mostly struck by that, by the degree to which they're coming together. So this theme of the proximity of the radical position and the Lincoln position was the first thing that struck me when I first started studying them, and that's what I was interested in. I was interested in the question of how does, and I'm still interested in, what does it take for anti-slavery politics to succeed? And part of it is how do you develop an anti-slavery politics that will have popular appeal? Right? And how do you build an anti-slavery constituency? So it's part of the theme I'm trying to work with on the Civil War book. The outcome of the war is determined to some extent by the success with which Lincoln and the Republicans are able to build a coalition that will restore the Union and destroy slavery. in the process. And whereas the Confederates were much less successful at building a coalition that would simultaneously secure their independence and perpetuate slavery.
Right.
And it's that coalition building process that I'm interested in. And it's two different kinds of coalitions. There's the narrowly political coalition, and you can see Lincoln and the Republicans over the course of the 1850s saying, look, we got to get these conservative Whigs, we got to tone it down on the fugitive slave stuff, we got to do this, we got to do that, these are the people we need, and then during the war you see Lincoln trying to get the Democrats to accept the need for a war to restore the Union, even if you don't want to restore, even if you're not interested in attacking slavery, you still want to restore the Union. So there's that political kind of coalition building that Lincoln was successful at. And then there's the kind of broader social coalition that requires the support of women and requires the support of slaves in the South and requires, and the Lincoln and the Republicans were just more successful at that. Whereas where the history of the Union war effort is the history of the successful building of this coalition, where the Republicans come to accept and require the participation of the slaves, for example, the increasingly aggressive participation of slaves. This history of the Confederacy is the history of a coalition that's rickety at the beginning during the secession crisis and falters. I mean, they lose the slaves, they lose the Upper South, they lose 4 slave states, never join the Confederacy, and over the course of the war, the Confederates themselves start falling away, right? And you get massive desertion from the Confederate Army by the end. So it's to the extent that I have a theme worked out, it's the continuation of this theme of how you succeed in building an anti-slavery politics, but also and increasingly, in addition, now I have to go back to my original work and explain how the slaveholders were able to secure political power they had, how that played out during the secession crisis or didn't play out, and then did or did not play out, and ultimately failed during the Civil War.
And do you think there's a point where Douglass sort of surpasses, say, William Lloyd Garrison as kind of like the main abolitionist, if you want to call it that, at least in terms of being kind of on the cutting edge of what's happening during the war and working with the administration? Because is Garrison kind of hamstrung by his anti-violence stance, at least initially? Do you see like there's sort of a split there, or am I wrong in saying that?
Well, of the split between Douglass and Garrison, or I don't know if it's a source of the split, but certainly by the 50s, we know that Douglass is prepared to advocate violence in a way that Garrison wasn't. But I don't think that was the source of the split. I think the source of the split was the question of political engagement.
Okay.
And that necessarily meant 2 different views of the Constitution.
Right. Yeah. Well, and so this book, I should say the name. I don't think I've said the name yet, but The Crooked Path to Abolition, it's called, right? And that's coming out next week or so?
In a few days, yeah.
A few days, okay.
So I'm going to have to get going. So
sure. Well, Jim, it's been great talking with you. Thanks for taking the time today.
Okay.
And good luck with the book.
Thank
and
you. This was fun.
Good. Yeah, it was fun. And I'll let you know when the podcast is ready. Should be a couple weeks. I'll send you the link and everything.
Great. I appreciate it.
All right, that was my talk with Jim Oakes. I hope you enjoyed that. Check out his most recent book, The Crooked Path to Abolition, Abraham Lincoln and the Anti-Slavery Constitution. That just came out, so get that on Amazon or any other place that you get books. And you can check out his earlier works going back to the ruling race, and you can get his other books on Lincoln and Douglass and the anti-slavery movement in America. This is American Rambler. I'm your host, Colin Woodward. Thank you for listening. You can support my work through Patreon, American Rambler, or you can buy my book, Marching Masters, Slavery, Race, and the Confederate Army During the Civil War, available through University of Virginia Press. Still going full price on Amazon, but you can get it from me direct $30. Just send me a message on Twitter and I will help you out. You can send a check or any other means that you can come up with. Don't send me loose change or anything, but we can work something out. But yeah, if you want it for $30, just contact me. You can also email me at colinedward828@gmail.com if that's how you want to do it. But haven't been selling a lot of books recently. Trying to make progress on my Johnny Cash book, reading through that, revising, and trying to get that ready to wrap it up this year. And I'm also looking for employment. So if you need a good historian on your staff, you can also contact me. I've got some things in the works right now, but nothing definite, and my current position ends in July. So things are a little uncertain right now, and we are also in the process of either buying our house or moving because our landlord is putting our house on the market on March 1st. So a very chaotic, complicated, busy time in 2021 over here at the Woodward household. I hope you're doing okay and staying safe and healthy out there wherever you are, and I will talk with you soon. Take care. Bye.